Hello everyone. Today I want to talk about a topic that I'm very passionate about, and I hope that you will be passionate about as well, and that is the ways in which Indigenous and settler knowledge systems about the environment interact and combine and conflict in complex ways. Now, one thing I want to point out right at the start, though, is that these are hardly a binary, and indeed I will critique the idea that they are a binary several times in this lecture. I think that is important to recognize that, for example, if we're talking about the knowledge system of the Dene or Navajo in the Southwest, or the Koyukon, or the Yanomami, or any other indigenous group, that is not a monolith, and in any community you'll have a diversity of perspectives, potentially among people in that community about their own sort of philosophy or cultural traditions, and people can come from multiple cultural traditions. Furthermore, when we say settler knowledge systems, we should also be, I think, careful with that terminology, as I've alluded to before. There's something empirical, something real world that we are pointing to, but we want to recognize that, quote, the West is not some kind of monolith, but instead itself very diverse, and indeed there are many people who would have, let's say, Euro-American and Euro-Canadian ancestry who would not agree with these viewpoints. So when we say sort of settler knowledge systems, we should be careful about that. Also because some of what we're characterizing as settler knowledge systems, we're really talking about sort of post-Enlightenment scientific method / industrial capitalism, and that is something that certainly is not confined to the West, although it may have originated there. So some important kind of points of consideration. Having said that, and having acknowledged that, nonetheless, I do want today to talk about indigenous and settler ways of viewing the environment and ways they can entangle in interesting ways. We'll talk about conflict and colonialism and resistance as our first theme. As our second theme, we'll talk about consultation and co-management. And as our last theme, we'll talk about collaboration and hybrid knowledge. And I am high-fiving myself right now because of that awesome alliteration with all of those words starting with C. Good job, Adam. You are just great. You were killing it at this PowerPoint game. All right, moving right along. Indigenous settler entanglements, co-management, environmentalism, and other topics. Part 1, conflict, colonialism, and resistance. 1990, the Oka crisis, where Mohawk protesters perform a blockading on a area that was going to be expanded for a golf course that was going to be expanded onto ancestral burial grounds. It eventually leads to a standoff with the Canadian Mounties, the RCMP, that gains national, if not international, attention. 2000, and extending into very much still today, activism and resistance around the expansion of a ski resort on the San Francisco Peaks, a mountain held sacred by 13 indigenous nations. 1985, all the way up through 2001, and really 2010 actually, Katie John, an Atna Athabascan Alaska Native woman, takes to court the issue of Batzel-Nados fishing camp as a part of a bigger issue about Alaska Native subsistence. This is a complex history that I won't be able to entirely explain in the short time we have together, but I did want to spend a little bit of time on this one. Katie Johns was born in the community of Batzel-Nados and lived there until 1937, and it was continued to be used after that fact as a part-time fishing area by Atna people in nearby communities. With statehood, the state of Alaska asserted control over fish and game resources in, as we say, in the state of Alaska. And eventually, by 1964, had outlawed fishing in this Batzel-Nados area. This was something that Alaska Native people were, in that community, were hardly pleased about. Atna people continued to fish there, but then they would be harassed by wildlife rangers. Harassed, I suppose, is loaded terminology. That's the terminology that was used in the article I'm referencing. But certainly they were deterred from fishing by wildlife rangers and told that that was now illegal in an area where people had been fishing for literally centuries. In the 1980s, there was the passage of a law called ANILCA, the Alaska National Interest Land Conservation Act, I believe is what that's an acronym for. Did a number of significant things, including dramatically expanding the amount of protected federal lands in Alaska, but one of the things that it did was a provision for Alaska Native people to have subsistence fishing and hunting rights on federal lands. that were specifically near to Alaska Native lands, so Alaska Native held lands, basically with the acknowledgement that many Alaska Native rural communities still did, and for that matter, rural communities in general. That was also part of the law, not necessarily just Alaska Native communities, but the recognition that many Alaska Native communities and rural Alaskan communities, period, relied heavily still on subsistence hunting and fishing, and that they needed land beyond their immediate land holding in which to do that, i.e. land within things like parks or national forests. So that happened in the 1980, but then Batzel continued to be closed down and shut down, and so then in 1984, Katie John, backed by the Native American Rights Fund, or NARF, took this to court, and thus precipitated a legal battle that would eventually take all the way until 2001. These environmental legal battles can stretch on and on and on. And so eventually the state did implement a limited fishery kind of thing, but it really was not viewed as sufficient by Katie John or other people in the community, and so this continued to go to court. Eventually, the federal courts essentially sided with Katie John in this case. The governor Knowles was going to potentially appeal it, but there was demonstrations by people here in Alaska, particularly Alaska Native people, and Governor Knowles went and visited Katie John at Batzel at a fishing camp, and got to see what they had done, and he walked away from that experience, at least according to his own words, with a changed perspective. He said, "I learned more that day than is written in all the boxes of legal briefs in this long-lasting court battle. I understand the strength, care, and values that subsistence gives to Katie John's family and to the thousands of similar families from Metlakatla to Bethel, from Norvik to Fort Yukon to Barrow, or Utqiagvik is what we say now. We all know that what Katie John does is not wrong, it is right for her, right for the village," and he asserted at the time that he would do what it was necessary to preserve Alaska Native subsistence rights. This has been made much more complicated by the fact that here in Alaska we have a dual management system. That's a complicated story, but essentially federal government manages fishing resources on federal waters, which itself is a matter of debate which waters count as that, and then state of Alaska manages fishery resources in other places as it is in states generally, unless it's an endangered species. So this is complicated, to say the least. People that were on the side of Katie John viewed it as, okay, well, you're protecting downstream users, you're protecting commercial fisheries that are taking thousands and thousands of fish, you're protecting recreational fishers, you're not protecting indigenous users in this one small area, presumably to help the downstream users have more fish. That was sort of the argument they made. Of course, people on the other side argued that it was a matter of conservation. It is notable how deeply ideas and knowledge and connection influenced this court case and this long-standing court case, including Katie John's personal attachment to this space where she'd been born, the experience of people fishing there over time, people visiting ancestors' cemeteries there, and more generally the sense of this being originally their fishing space, right? So both historic use and ideas about who the landscape was, who the waterscape was for, so to speak, eventually resulting in a court case, in a legal victory, but one that really took decades to occur, and to some degree the implications of which are still playing out. 2008 to 2016, and really since then as well, these were just two times when it sort of started up and then when it was really flaring up, the Save Mauna Kea movement to prevent construction of the 3 Mile Telescope on a mountain called Mauna Kea in Hawaii, recognized as sacred, also recognized as traditional royal land by Hawaiians, particularly those asserting indigenous sovereignty claims and links to the past monarchy. 2016, you may not have heard of this one, or this one, you'll most likely have heard of this one, the No Dakota Access Pipeline movement, which in 2016 was very noteworthy and newsworthy. And to some degree, of course, has continued since then. A movement starting with Lakota people blockading oil pipeline land, or blockading where the oil pipeline was going to go to transport oil from Canada into the US. Originally started out as mainly indigenous protesters, but eventually from that specific area, but eventually gathered thousands of people from across North America in terms of indigenous as well as non-indigenous communities. that movement was successful in considerably delaying pipeline construction, eventually leading to the Obama administration agreeing to re-review, essentially administratively delay, if not potentially cancel, the pipeline, although that was almost immediately struck down when President Trump took office and the pipeline proceeded. But notable that people were willing to stand in the way of a pipeline, be sprayed frozen water on them in the middle of the night, be generally having to face the brunt of some pretty aggressive attempts to break up the protest blockade. In other words, engage in direct action, sometimes with arrests, in partly because of ideas, because of beliefs, because of knowledge. Lake Oahe is regarded as sacred, and more generally, this lies within land that is regarded by many Lakota people, although this is a matter of some historic debate, but regarded by many Lakota people as unceded, that it was covered under under treaty, but one that many consider invalid. It's land just outside of the Standing Rock Reservation. People were willing to take time in a community that suffers endemic and serious structural poverty. People were willing to take time to try to block this pipeline. It's notable, and for many people even get arrested and incur the legal costs that come with that. Of course, it wasn't just a matter of ideas, it was also a matter of environmental health. People were asserting that the pipeline might leak into Cannonball River, which is just half mile upstream, and part of the water source for Standing Rock Reservation. But the power of ideas, powers of knowledge, and especially as these ideas proliferated with social media, it would be difficult to overstate the importance of social media for environmental campaigns by Indigenous people. 40 years ago, environmental campaigns such as OCA, I guess that would be 30 years ago, would get national or even international news attention, but many of the smaller ones would not get that kind of attention, and even the ones that did get that kind of attention, right, they'd be in the news for a little while, but it wasn't necessarily, but it was reliant on the news media actually picking it up, and some battles were picked up, some weren't, and of the ones that were, they would oftentimes be, it would depend, sometimes they'd get a lot of attention, especially nearby, but in a broader news market, not very much. Social media has changed the game significantly, where Indigenous people are now able often to directly speak to the public, not through the medium of a news agency, using social media, using hashtags like NoDapple or Save Mauna Kea. And I don't think unrelatedly, environmental organizing by Indigenous peoples over the last 20 years seems to have both sped up and become more significant and more widespread and more widely recognized by non-native people. I was very surprised with the Dakota Access Pipeline when I saw a notable shift where it went from being only sort of, you heard about it if you subscribed to native news sources or social media feeds, to suddenly I saw it popping up all over my social media feeds, even with non-native people. So social media has changed the game considerably. 2010 is when this one started, although it still was going strong in 2020. The Wet'suwet'en blockades, it really picked up steam in the 2020. Basically, blockades in British Columbia, from the perception from people who felt that the traditional hereditary chiefs of the Wet'suwet'en people had not been properly consulted on an oil pipeline, and people were willing to block roads and block railways with wood and other barriers as a result, and again face potential legal penalties. My point with all of these, well, a couple of points, one of which is the profound effect that, yes, politics, yes, environmental health concerns, but also ideas, right? Many of these stories that we had talked about landscapes that had sacred meaning, such as Lake Oahe, or had meaning on a very historic level, such as Mauna Kea, as both, I knew that did not look right, Mauna Kea, which has significance both as a sacred site, but also as a site of royalty, as a site of a historic sovereignty that has since been considerably diminished and taken over. Subsistence as more than just subsistence, but something having to do with values that is given to a culture and to a family. Sacred mountains that, 13 nations hold as sacred, and therefore they're willing to engage in activism over 20 years. My point with this is ideas matter, and ideas figure prominently in Indigenous environmentalism. Point number two is a protest chant that I've sometimes heard from Indigenous people or seen online: respect existence or expect resistance. I don't know the origin of that quote, but it's common. You probably have heard of it too. Respect existence or expect resistance. one that has been cited many times as people go before bulldozers or construction. Whatever your political views, and I expect that in this class we vary wildly on our political views, and that's good and healthy and wonderful that we can do that in a college classroom, but whatever our political views, as individuals that are going to work in a world where we have to figure out issues of culture and ecology, and especially in Alaska where we face these issues very, very often. And as a class where some of us are going directly into fields that impact this, such as environmental policy or consulting, I want you to realize that if we do not consider Indigenous environmental organizing seriously, we are missing just a huge piece of the puzzle of culture and ecology. It is one of our most notable and visible examples of how knowledge systems and idea systems matter in a very real world, that they're able to motivate people to take direct action, to do protests, to do legal cases that take decades. Indigenous environmentalism is a force to be reckoned with, and within Indigenous environmentalism, ideas are extremely powerful. I will also want you to notice that over the last couple of decades, as you may have noticed with some of those examples, we're increasingly seeing something that I've called before hybrid environmentalism, by which I mean environmentalism that is not solely or mainly Indigenous people, nor is it solely or mainly an Indigenous group on one hand, and an environmental group like Sierra Club or Rainforest Action Network on the other hand, and they're sort of allying temporarily, but still two separate groups. Instead, what we're seeing more and more is grassroots movements from the ground up, which have considerable numbers of both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people from a variety of different cultural backgrounds and positionalities, which can lead to the production of what I'm going to call hybrid knowledge later. So Indigenous environmentalism then, though, is a force to be reckoned with, and one that we need to take seriously and understand as an important part of the culture ecology sort of landscape as we talk about cultural knowledge systems. Now I want to talk a little bit about Indigenous environmental activism. There's a lot of different ways we could call that. During NODAPL, there was a push for people to instead use the term water protectors, or sometimes we've heard land protectors as well, rather than activism or environmentalism. There are some good reasons for that, including that in many cases people assert that part of what they're doing is laying claim to and exercising sovereignty for a traditional ancestral space that was their sovereign land, is their sovereign land, and so it makes sense. Activism also has a particularly sort of American history within things like the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, so there's multiple reasons why people might prefer other terms, but whether we call it activism or environmental organizing or direct action, whatever we're calling it, Indigenous environmentalism is a phenomena that is very interesting, and we have to see it as one that's deeply influenced by ideas. What kinds of ideas? Well, for one, the idea first and foremost of being Indigenous, of being a people of the land. What does that mean? I mean, aren't all human beings kind of situated in a certain land? Yes. Aren't all human beings dependent on their local land in a variety of ways, sometimes obvious, sometimes hidden? Yes. So what are we really saying, though? When I've heard people express the statement, including Indigenous environmental organizers, things like, as Indigenous people, we are people of the land, and use that as sort of a standalone statement to explain why they're involved in a struggle. What is it that somebody's saying with that? The way I understand that statement, among other things, is that part of what we're talking about is the fact that Indigenous cultural groups have persisted over centuries, if not millennia, in certain spaces, and that the attachments, the cultural relationships with the ecology of that area have a depth, a temporal depth, and a specificity that really can only come from centuries in the same space, and a reliance on that space, and a sustainable existence within that space. I think we're also getting at the idea that subsistence is not just subsisting. So we sometimes use the term subsistence in our state to mean a certain kind of hunting and fishing, right? We sometimes use subsistence in anthropology, as I have in this course, to mean the basic way in which a society gets food. What I want us to understand in regard to Alaska Native communities, as well as many other communities, is that subsistence is not just subsisting, but instead when we're talking about ways that people gain food and resources from their environment, we're talking about something much bigger than just how you put food on the table. We're talking about identity, right? And something that persists even if people's foodways have started to shift. So for example, Gwichin community in Arctic Village that we talked about, people still rely heavily on wild food, but people also obviously have store-bought food as well, but people still conceptualize themselves as, we are Gwichin, we are caribou people. Down here in South Central Alaska, you'll have indigenous people that will say things like, "We are salmon people," right? If the salmon were gone, we would die. Lakota have traditionally sometimes been called a buffalo people, right? The relationship with the environment through gaining food as not just gaining food, but as a way in which identity is forged and a way in which people think through their identity, as the reading you did on the Yukon area, or sorry, the Kuskokwim area, co-management talks about, right? And Yupik people teaching Yupik kids about what it means to be Yupik through this practice of widespread fishing during the summer. When we're talking about subsistence, we're also talking about more than human beings, a term that came up in that reading as well. If you've not heard that term, what people are talking about when they use that term in anthropology and other environmental social sciences is the idea of animals or mountains or plants that are recognized in a society as being, in a sense, sentient or animate entities, parts of your society. I've sometimes used the phrase non-human social, a society that includes not just us humans, us Homo sapiens, but also other kinds of people, animal people, plant people. In many Alaska Native stories, for example, animals traditionally in early times could communicate with humans, had different kinds of interactions with humans, could even transform back and forth because there was actually a person underneath who then in a sense had an animal covering. So for example, there's Yupik stories that talk about, a young girl that would oftentimes go into the field and eat grass and things like that, and then she had a feather coat, and then in the springtime she disappeared because what she really was a goose, but she was like a person underneath and looked like a person underneath, and that's how people understood her. There's a great Wakwa story called Day Hunter, Night Hunter, where they talk about a similar concept. A young chief's son finds a seal cave, and in the seal cave he sees that the seals have removed their seal covering, and inside they are people. Among certain Amazonian groups, there's a concept that, Viveros de Castro, I was blanking on his name for a minute, calls perspectivism, but the idea that animals see themselves as the people and us as the animals, particularly jaguars and things like that may hunt a human being sometimes, or at least allegedly do. So this idea of more than human beings that we relate to, within traditionally Alutiiq or Shukpiaq society, the idea that whales offered themselves to be hunted by whalers, especially, and that could be encouraged by drawing beautiful pictures of whales and putting them within your boat. So subsistence then, as you can see from all those examples, I hope, is about more than just putting food on the table. And it's not just an instance of if we took away this meat source, we could replace it with another meat source, and bada bing, it's the same thing. Or even we could take away a meat source and replace it with another plant protein source. But instead, it often involves all sorts of different relationships with animal life that are part of that social web. So when we think about activism, we have to think about it and start understanding that for many indigenous communities, animals are not resources, although they might partly be that. Yes, of course, they're food resources. People use them to eat. But also in a very real way, they are also regarded by many people, particularly traditionally, as people in some regard. You can see this indeed in some communities by the way in which you have to linguistically mark when you're talking about human beings. So for example, in Navajo, people would just say people when they're talking about Homo sapien people, but they'll also sometimes say five-fingered people, and to clarify and distinguish when they're also in the same sentence or whatever talking about bird people. So I saw an activist do that one time. Bird people versus five-fingered people, right? Homo sapiens versus the birds who are also people. Or in Dena'ina stories, the idea of campfire people. So Homo sapiens, and particularly Dena'ina, referred to as campfire people, as opposed to the other kinds of people, right, by implication. So peoplehood then of non-human entities means that we have to think about subsistence in much bigger terms than we may be familiar with, and think about that as a key part of activism, that activism is often organized because of this sense of non-human personhood. There's a reading that I didn't have you do because there's just too many great readings to do in this class, but it's by Marisol de Cadena. She talks about cosmopolitics. It's a great one, especially if you're going into graduate school. It's a fun one to really dig your teeth into. It covers a lot of interesting territory. She talks about environmental activism in Peru, if I'm not mistaken, in the Andean region of Peru, as well as Ecuador, as well. So she has a couple of different sites, and in the Peruvian site, she talks about people I think it's Peru. Am I right on this? I hope so. She talks about people protesting for a mining not to occur in a nearby mountain. And as she talked to people, she realized this was not just a matter of people worrying about pollution or something, but instead, as she spoke to people, people said things like the mountain will be angry and accidents will happen, like that the mountain would actually afflict people because the mountain was a being and not just a hunk of rock. And so you cannot understand many forms of activism if you don't have that as part of the picture of it. And also spiritual connections people have with landscape. The idea that land is sacred, which can often motivate activism that lasts an incredibly long period of time, which brings me to my point. Ideas have staying power. I'm tempted to quote V for Vendetta here, and the idea from Alan Moore that, quote, ideas are bulletproof, right? So ideas have staying power. In the case study where I've done a lot of work down in Arizona, not to malign anybody that was involved, but there were certain outside group or groups that were involved for quite a while, but eventually kind of, I wouldn't say pulled out entirely, but pulled out a lot of their effort when the court cases were not going in the direction of a success. Any environmental campaign or group has a certain amount of resources and has to figure out where to divvy those. It's different if you're a grassroots group who has sacred emotional attachments going back to this land and physical attachments to this land going back millennia, right? And there you have people who have continued their activism over decades, as well as invited other people around them, native and not native, to continue their activism over decades. Ideas have staying power. This is an image from the Save the Confluence campaign, a campaign that sought to and was successful at stopping resort development at the confluence or the meeting ground of the Little Colorado and Colorado River, which within Navajo cosmology is a male and female river and regarded by some people, particularly local people, as the origin place from which the holy beings, both animal people and human people, emerged from the lower world into the present day world. So that was a project that its proponents argued would lead to significant jobs in an area that oftentimes has had significant, even by the standards of that specific area, significant economic stagnation and jobs issues. So some people were very much, including some Navajo people, feeling that it would be a job gain, but other people were very much feeling that it was a disrespect to traditional stories and a desecration. So there's that spiritual side to it, that emotional side. But even when groups have changed, perhaps religious identities, adopted new faiths, you'd be surprised how much traditional landscapes and cultural ideas still deeply inform activism and policy and ideas about the land. Where I work with, again in Arizona, it was not uncommon for Christian Navajo to, some would say, well, it's, I don't think it's a sacred land, but others would still hold it as a very sacred, holy place, despite having changed, no longer being following a sort of solely traditional Navajo worldview. And similarly up here in Alaska, you oftentimes have communities that have converted strongly over to Russian Orthodoxy or other Christian communities and have been so for 200 years or 100 years, and yet still feel very strongly in spiritual ways about these landscapes and about these more than human beings again. So it doesn't always have to be sort of an overtly religious thing, or sometimes it is religious, but not necessarily the traditional religion, but people maintain these connections to space. All of which leads us to a point from Libby Roderick's great book on Alaska Native questions, where she says, quote, subsistence is the term most often used to describe a way of life that Alaska's Native peoples have lived for thousands of years, and the way all cultures lived prior to the development of agriculture. It's a way of life in which everything, the economy, people's relationships to one another, philosophy, spirituality, science, technology, healthcare, artistic expression, education, jokes, ideas about gender and sexuality, entertainment, the creation of tools, shelter, and clothing is intimately tied to the land and the waters upon which the people depend for sustenance. I generally dislike sweeping statements about cultures. I'm a bit of a particularist, or perhaps even a Boasian in this regard. But I think Libby Roderick's got a really good point here, and I would actually extend that to some agricultural groups as well. The ways in which we get food, oftentimes profoundly, as we've talked about many times, are tied in with a whole lot of other things than just food. And just as food can shape other things in a society, the converse is also true, that our ideas about what it means to be a human being shapes how we live in the environment. And oftentimes, again, even as technology has started to shift, even if people have started to shift a little bit in how they eat or what they eat, ideas can continue to be very powerful. We saw that in the video from the first week of class about the Gwichin. This is, I hate to keep beating this case, but it's a good example of what we're talking about here. In addition to, like we talked about that first week, this idea of, this is a valuable meat source for many people, there's also very much these ideas behind who the caribou are, and then the sacred stories, I believe I'm quoting Alan Boris here, but it says the Gwichin and caribou lived in peaceful intimacy, quote unquote, after Gwichin differentiated from animals and became people. Note that common flux, again, that idea of a fluidity between animals and people in many traditional indigenous cosmologies in the early days, and then the idea that humans became more different over time. Even in Taoism, there's ideas like this. Anyways, the relationship remained, and caribou are said, quote, to have a little bit of human heart. That means they can communicate thoughts and feelings. All animals are to be respected, but none except the bear more than the caribou. So if you're trying to understand indigenous environmental activism, then you have to understand those ideas and those connections and those beliefs and those knowledge systems that have evolved over time and allowed people to subsist in that land, to sustain in that land, to have relationships with the beings around them in a certain way in that land. And yet at the same time, we cannot solely look at ideas, but also have to understand political and economic factors, lest you think that I'm sort of solely a Geertzian here, solely thinking that ideas matter. We also sometimes really have to think about histories here. And indeed, histories is sort of a form of idea, by which I mean histories of dispossession, histories of colonialism that have shaped present-day environmental battles because people see this land as sort of symbolic of or an extension of an ongoing resistance to colonialism. Mauna Kea is a great example where it is not solely the spiritual beliefs about Mauna Kea, but definitely Mauna Kea is symbolic of a movement back to Hawaiian sovereignty. Or the Oka crisis, right? It's not just the fact that it was in ancestral grounds, but also is tied in with a bigger history of Mohawk land dispossession. There's a lot more going on there than beliefs, although beliefs are incredibly important, and there's a lot more going on there than knowledge systems, although that's very important as well as beliefs. A good example would be back to the Dakota Access Pipeline. An important context for that is understanding that the Oseti-Sakowin, the Seven Council Fires, or the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota people, who sometimes call Sioux, although that's pretty much out of favor at this point, that people traditionally had a land whose base was a lot more like this, and then was eventually confined to reservations that looked a lot more like this. And I use the term confined intentionally. This wasn't true of all Native American reservations, but for many of the Lakota reservations, it's very much the case that after active military conflict, they were essentially imprisoned in a very real sense within reservations and told, do not leave this area. And that remained that way for decades. Given that, you can understand how a group of people that traditionally relied almost entirely on buffalo hunting, well, what happens when you remove most of the bison and then also remove most of the territory in which the bison are hunted? Well, what's going to happen is the traditional economy is going to be relegated to almost nothing. People are not going to be able to do subsistence in the way they once did. You take that away, what do you have? Farming? Well, sure, that's not what people were originally used to. So first of all, there's a huge learning gap that has to come from that. It's being forced unjustly on the group of people. That's another thing. Furthermore, is that actually the most productive way of using that kind of land, right? So there's a lot of different things going on there for that not being fully sustainable as well. And farming typically takes a huge amount of investment of time and effort and learning and land before it can kind of get to its productive space, the kind of farming at least that gets done in the US. What other kinds of things? Industrial and commercial businesses? Difficult to do those when you're far away from any major population centered and most forms of major capital that are found within industrial centers. So these are all factors that have contributed to the fact that, for example, on the Pine Ridge Reservation, 90% of Pine Ridge lives below the poverty line. And it is one of, if not the most impoverished census areas in the country. You cannot understand, with an 80 to 90% unemployment rate and a median income of $4,000 a year, you cannot understand the Dakota Access Pipeline movement solely as an environmental justice issue, worried about environmental contamination of the water, nor can you understand it solely as an issue of the sacred land of Lake Oahe, although it is a sacred space, religiously significant space. You have to understand it in context of histories of dispossession and colonialism, as has been argued by Lakota authors. and native authors such as Tom Estes, you have to understand it in the context of that colonialism. And so it is for much of Indigenous activism. It has to be put in both the context of people's cosmology or their worldview, but also their politics and their experiences of colonialism over generations, which itself forms a significant and important part of said worldview. So that's a little bit about Indigenous environmentalism. I'll pause the video there.